the October of the year 1704, off the coast of Chile, a Scottish sailing master named Alexander Selkirk stood up in a launch off the side of a leaking privateer, looked his captain in the face in front of the rowing crew, and told him that the ship was rotten and would not survive the voyage home. The captain, whose name was Stradling, told him that if he was so very sure of it, he was welcome to leave the company. Selkirk, who had a temper of his own and a Scotsman's particular pride in not being out-argued, said that he would. They put him ashore on the nearest island, which was a green volcanic mountain rising abruptly out of the Pacific Ocean called Mas a Tierra, 400 miles west of the South American coast, and gave him a musket, 1.5 pounds of gunpowder, a small bag of ball, a knife, a hatchet, a kettle, a few pounds of tobacco, his sea chest of clothes, a Bible, and the navigation instruments he had brought with him from Scotland. They rowed back to the Cinque Ports in the long evening light. Selkirk stood on the white shingle of the beach and watched them go. He was 28 years old. He believed he would be picked up in a few months by some passing English ship. As the launch grew smaller and the cries from her became indistinguishable from the cries of the seabirds along the cliffs above him, it occurred to him for the first time that he might be wrong. By the time that Cinque Ports had run her sail up and turned for the coast, he was running down the beach after her, calling that he had reconsidered. Stradling, on the quarterdeck, watched him through a glass and made no signal. The ship sailed. He was, as it happened, exactly right about the Cinque Ports. She foundered within a month off the coast of what is now Colombia. Most of her crew drowned. The remainder were taken alive by Spanish coast guards and shipped to Lima, where they were put in irons and died, mostly in prison. Of the men who had laughed at Selkirk in the launch that evening, scarcely one ever saw Scotland again. He did not know this. He would not know it for more than 4 years. He had asked to be saved from the Cinque Ports, and the sea, with its quiet thoroughness, had granted him exactly that. This is the story of a man who was punished for his judgment and who lived alone for 4 years and 4 months on a Pacific island, while the men who had refused to listen to him drowned, and who came home in goatskin clothes to find that his stubbornness had been the saving of him, and whose name, by an accident of a kind that is rarer in life than in literature, has outlived almost every other name from his century. We shall come, in time, to that part of the story. It is the smaller part. The larger part is what he did in the 4 years and 4 months. He was a lowland Scot, from a town on the Firth of Forth called Lower Largo, the 7th son of a tanner and shoemaker named John Selkirk, for that was the family name, which he had altered in the privateering way when he went to sea. He had run away to sea young. He had a name on the Largo waterfront for fighting in church, of all places. He had served as a sailing master on Dampier's privateering expedition into the Pacific in 1703, an expedition that had run into difficulties of every kind, that had lost men, that had quarreled, that had broken into 2 ships, and that had ended for Selkirk, after a year of these difficulties, on the beach at Mas a Tierra, in his own clothes with his own opinion vindicated, and no one at all to share the vindication with. The captain who had marooned him, Thomas Stradling, was not an unjust man. He was a man of fixed opinions who did not like to be contradicted in front of his crew. Selkirk had contradicted him, loudly, on the question of whether the worm-eaten timbers of the Cinque Ports would hold for the long Atlantic crossing back. Stradling had given the order. Selkirk had refused. The matter, on a privateer, was customarily settled by gunpowder or by marooning, and Stradling had chosen the more humane of the two. There is a kind of justice in it which the men of that century could appreciate, and which the men of ours have lost the taste for. It was not personal. It was, in the most exact sense of the word, professional. The man himself, on the beach, took some hours to understand his condition. He had been put ashore on Tierra before, briefly, 2 years earlier, by Dampier's company, to take on water. He knew the place a little. He knew there were goats on it, left there by some Spanish or Portuguese sailor a century before to provide meat for visiting ships, and that the goats had bred and gone wild and could be hunted with a musket. He knew there was a fresh stream coming down from the green slopes. He knew that the bay he was on was the best anchorage on the island, and that any ship coming to the island would come into that bay, and that he had only, therefore, to be on the beach when she came. He sat there until the sun went down. He built a small fire because he had grown cold. He ate nothing. He looked at the sea, and at the sky, and at the high green ridges behind him. And as the dark came on, he understood. Slowly, in the way a man understands a thing he does not want to be true, that the Cinque Ports was not coming back, and that the next ship might be a week away, or a month away, or a year away, and that there was nothing in the world he could do between now and then to alter that fact. There are men, of course, who would have gone mad on the beach that night. There are men who would have gone into the water. The historical evidence on Selkirk's first weeks consists of one terse sentence in his own later testimony, that he was, in his own phrase, much dejected, but the next 4 years would prove that he was not, in any final way, a man who broke under solitude. He was a Scot, raised in the Calvinist church, taught from infancy that life was a trial whose terms were not negotiable, and that one's business was to bear them. He banked the fire. He slept in his clothes on the shingle. He woke at dawn. He began. The first thing he did was set the goats against the rats. This requires a little explanation. The rats had come to the island in the holds of the same ships that had brought the goats. They were everywhere. They were not afraid of him. They came into his first shelter at night and bit him as he slept and ate his provisions out of the kettle. He shot the ones he could and beat the others off. But they were 100 to 1, and they would have, in time, made the island unlivable for him in just the small attritional way that rats make places unlivable for men. He noticed in the second month that there were also cats on the island, small, half-wild descendants of pet cats that some earlier visitor's ship had left behind, and that the cats took rats when they could catch them. He took to leaving small portions of his goat meat near the cats' wandering paths, where the rats also came. The cats fed. The cats grew bold around him, and in time, the cats followed him to his hut and slept across the doorway and killed the rats that tried to enter in the night. He did not domesticate them. They merely settled at the threshold of the only warm fire on the island and made their living off the only thing on the island that fed them. And the result of this arrangement was that the rats withdrew and Selkirk slept. It was the first of many small accommodations he made. There were others. He learned to outrun the wild goats over the steep volcanic ridges because his powder gave out in the second year and he could not shoot them after that. He cut the soft pimento wood and built 2 huts, one inland for the rains and one near the beach for the watch. He pickled goat meat in salt he made from seawater boiled in his kettle. He used the goat's skins for clothes when his own clothes wore through, and he sewed them with a needle he made by filing down a nail with a rock. He read the Bible aloud at fixed hours, twice a day, because he discovered in the first year that if he did not speak aloud, he would lose the use of his voice altogether. And he had observed that this had happened to certain sailors he had known who had been long alone and had come back not quite right in the head. He turned out, in short, to be a man who did very well on his island by an unusual combination of patience and ingenuity and a certain lowland practicality that had been bred into him by ancestors who had farmed the same hard fields for a great many generations. He was not happy. The journal he kept, small, on scraps of paper he had with him, in a hand that grew larger and looser with the months, was not the journal of a happy man, but he was not destroyed. He went into a routine, and the routine carried him. And at the end of each day, he had done the things the day required, and the things had been enough. He saw 2 ships in the first 3 years. He went down to the beach and built up his signal fire when they appeared. Both, on coming nearer, proved to be Spanish. And Spanish ships in those waters had a particular interest in any Englishman they could lay hands on. The first one he merely hid from, in the high palms behind the bay. The second one sent a landing party ashore, who found his huts and his fire, and pursued him into the interior of the island for the better part of an afternoon, firing their muskets at him through the trees while he ran upward toward the central ridge. He climbed a tree. They passed beneath him. He lay along a branch of that tree until full dark, and then he came down and went back to his huts and continued his life. He did not record the date of this either. Time on the island had ceased, for him, to be the kind of thing it was anywhere else. The point about the dates is worth pausing on. Selkirk kept time in the European fashion for, by his own later account, about the first year. After that, the strict counting of days began to seem to him like the kind of fastidiousness only people who have things to be on time for can afford. He went by seasons and by the position of the sun on certain ridges that marked the year's turns, and that was enough. When he was rescued, he could not have told you, to any accuracy, what date in February he was rescued on. The European world that was about to take him back into itself would prove, to his quiet astonishment, to have kept on counting all that time. It was their custom. He did not, ever afterward, much care for it. On the 1st of February, in the year 1709, in a clear early morning, 2 ships anchored in the bay below his huts. They were English. They were a privateering expedition out of Bristol, under a Captain Woods Rogers, with 2 ships, the Duke and the Duchess, and a remarkable man as their navigator, William Dampier himself, who had been on the original expedition that had put Selkirk on the island 4 years before. Rogers had come into the bay because Tierra was the standard watering stop for English privateers in those waters, and he needed water. Selkirk had seen the ships at dawn from his high lookout. He had run down to the bay through the wet undergrowth, in his goatskins, with his beard reaching to his belt and his hair tangled in his eyes. and his English so badly worn down by 4 years of disuse that he was no longer entirely sure he could produce it on demand. He built up his signal fire on the beach. He waved his hands in the way of men. He had not, when the landing party came ashore, the words to greet them with, and what he did instead was to run forward and embrace the officer in front and weep, and then turn and run back into the trees and bring out a goat he had cooked for them and offer it. The officer was a man named Thomas Dover. He afterwards said that he had taken the apparition on the beach for some kind of savage and had nearly shot him. Rogers came ashore. He listened. He understood gradually who the man was. He carried Selkirk aboard the Duke and gave him European clothes, which Selkirk refused to wear because they hurt him. He gave him European food, most of which Selkirk could not, after 4 years of goat and crabs and turnips. Hold down. The cats came down to the beach and watched him go. They watched the boats pull away. Then, presumably, they went on with their lives. Their descendants are still on the island. The island today is called Robinson Crusoe Island, which is a name we shall come to. Rogers asked the question one would ask. Selkirk said that the only one of those years he could not have endured a second of was the first, because he had been so very alone. After that, he had had the goats and the cats and the Bible and the work. He said that he had, in time, grown to prefer his island to the company of most of the men he had ever sailed with. He said this without bitterness, as though stating a fact of nature. Then they told him about the Cinque Ports. They told him that the ship he had argued the rottenness of, in October of 1704, had foundered the following month off the South American coast. They told him that most of her crew had drowned. They told him that the few who had not drowned had been captured by Spanish patrols and had been carried in irons to Lima, and had, in the manner of English privateers in Spanish prisons in that century, died there. They told him that, of the men who had rowed him to the beach, those who had laughed at him from the launch, the man who had given the order, Thomas Stradling himself was alive, but only because he had not been on the ship when she went down, having gone aboard the Spanish ship that had taken her men prisoner. Almost no one was left. The Maupassant in this would not let me pass over the next sentence in silence. It is necessary to say it directly. The man who had been put off the doomed ship for being right about it had lived 4 years on a quiet island, eaten well, slept well in the end, and come out at 32 years old in respectable health. The men who had stayed aboard the ship had, almost to a man, drowned or died in chains. The punishment Stradling had selected for Selkirk's insubordination had been, with a precision a novelist would have hesitated to invent, the saving of him. Selkirk did not say very much about it at the time. Rogers said in his published account that the Scotsman went quiet for some hours after hearing the news, and then went on the deck and stood at the rail looking at the island slipping away under their stern, and that he asked eventually whether the cats would be all right. He came home to Scotland on the Duke by way of the long privateering voyage around the world, which took the better part of 2 more years, and which made him a rich man, because the Duke and the Duchess between them captured a Manila galleon off the coast of California and divided its silver among the crew according to the articles. He arrived at the door of his father's cottage in Lower Largo in October of 1711, in good clothes, with money in his pocket, and discovered that his family had given him up for dead. His own mother did not recognize him at the door. When she did, she made a noise that the neighbors remembered for the rest of their lives. He did not, you understand, settle. He was a famous man. Briefly, Rogers's book of the voyage came out in 1712, and Selkirk's story was the part everyone read. Richard Steele tracked him down and wrote a long, admiring piece about him in The Englishman in 1713. He was invited into drawing rooms in London, where the company in low voices begged him to describe the island. He was, for a season, the most interesting man in the English-speaking world. None of it, by his own admission, gave him anything like the contentment of the island had. He drank. He fought. He took to walking, in the long autumn evenings, far out along the cliffs above Lower Lago, by himself, the way he had walked the ridges of Tierra. He built a small cave-like shelter in his father's garden, where he slept on warm nights because the cottage felt close. He married a girl named Sophia Bruce, briefly, and then deserted her. He married another, a widow named Frances Candice, who was sturdy enough to keep him for a few years. And then in the end, the sea, which had been calling to him in his sleep all that time, called too loud, and he answered it. He shipped out in 1720 on a Royal Navy warship called the Weymouth, bound for the West African coast on anti-pirate duty. He died of a fever off the Gold Coast in December of 1721 and was buried at sea, and the ship sailed on without him, in exactly the way the Cinque Ports had sailed on without him 17 years before. He would have ended there. He would have been remembered, if at all, as a Bristol privateer's curiosity, a footnote in Woodes Rogers's voyage. He owed his survival in history to a man he never met. A London journalist named Daniel Defoe had read Rogers's account and Steele's account, and the half-dozen pamphlets that had followed, and in the spring of 1719, 8 years after Selkirk's return, 2 years before his death, Defoe published a novel based, in its essentials, on the story of the man on the island. He changed the name to Robinson Crusoe. He changed the island. He moved the marooning to the Caribbean. He invented a savage companion, a shipwreck, a return to civilization, an entire interior life that the real Selkirk had given few signs of possessing. He made of the 4 years and 4 months a parable of human ingenuity and divine providence that the lowland Scot, with his terse practicality and his fondness for cats, would scarcely have recognized as himself. And the parable, not the man, conquered the world. Robinson Crusoe became, within the lifetime of its author, the most widely read novel of the 18th century. It has never been out of print. It is now, by the count of some scholars, the most translated work of fiction in any language, after the Bible itself. The actual Alexander Selkirk lies somewhere on the floor of the Gulf of Guinea. His island, in the Juan Fernández group, was renamed in 1966 by the government of Chile in a tourist gesture. It is now called Robinson Crusoe Island. The other island in the group, a smaller one further out, was renamed at the same time. It is called Alexander Selkirk Island. He never set foot on it. This, in its quiet way, is the second reversal of the story, and the one Maupassant himself would have admired more than the first. The first reversal was that the punishment chosen for the man had been the saving of him. The second reversal is that the saving of him and the saving of his name has come down to us, not under his name, but under the name of a novelist's invention. The novel survived. The novelist survived. The island survived. The man who actually did the thing has, in the strict sense, been swallowed by the novel he inspired, has had his real name lifted off him like a coat and replaced with the printed name of a character. And a tourist arriving on that island today, asking which beach the marooned man was set down upon, will hear his guide reply, in perfect good faith, that it was Robinson Crusoe's. They have, in time, become the same person. The novel ate the man. There is one further small detail. When the Duke came into that bay on the 1st of February in 1709, and Selkirk ran down through the trees in his goatskins, he carried with him to the beach 2 of his cats. He did not say so in any account he gave. Woodes Rogers does not mention it, but Steele's piece in The Englishman of 1713 contains a sentence, dropped almost as an aside, in which the journalist remarks that the rescued man, when his English came back to him, would speak of his cats in a tone he otherwise reserved for human beings he had loved. He took the 2 of them aboard the Duke with him. He kept them with him for the homeward voyage. One of them, an old grey female, made the entire journey around the world with him and lived in his father's cottage in Lower Largo and outlived him. There is no record of where she came from originally or what became of her in the end. Her descendants, if she had any, will have died on the east coast of Fife 2 centuries ago. The cats she left behind on the island, however, are still there. They're kittens, by now a great many generations down, still hunt the rats among the green volcanic ridges of what is, now by the choice of strangers, called Robinson Crusoe Island. They are the only inhabitants of the place who could be said, in any honest sense, to be descended from the original story. It is, when you stand back from it, the kind of small, unobserved point at which Maupassant's eye loved to settle. The man asked to be saved from a doomed ship. The sea saved him. The sea then ate his ship and his shipmates, and in a slower way, ate him too. Sent him back out to die of a fever off Africa, took his name, and gave the name of his rescuer's story to his island. What is left of him is a cottage with no Selkirks in it, an island that does not bear his name, and a colony of feral cats on a Pacific volcanic slope, descended from animals he once fed scraps of goat to, going about their work in the silence he left. He asked to be marooned. He was. And in the end, the sea, which is patient and is not in a hurry, marooned him again and again and again, until there was no part of him left that could be called by his right name. He would have understood. He had 4 years and 4 months in which to understand exactly what the sea was. He came back and lived poorly among us, who had not understood it. And then he went back, and the sea, with the same quiet thoroughness it had shown the first time, did for him what it had been waiting to do. He had asked after all. The sea, in its own way, never refuses a man who asks.